In this module, we are discussing pharmaceutical validation. We examine what triggered the whole concept and the evolution of the concept and practice of pharmaceutical validation over the decades, and what is expected of you as of today in terms of validation. In the 60s and 70s, there was an unprecedented explosion of drugs and devices that were introduced into the market, not all of which were safe or efficacious or even bore a remote resemblance to quality. As a consequence, there were ever so many who died and far many more who were left injured or maimed. The enforcement agencies were running from pillar to post, trying to enforce compliance. Inspections, imposing sanctions, ordering recalls, and in the worst case, forcing companies to shut down. Now, why was this? Because the industry did not have a practice of having written instructions, standard operating procedures, or a proper system of documentation. So the regulators felt that just as in all other industries, inspecting for quality is a way of life. They instituted the concept of quality control. Have proper specifications, have a test method, identify the instruments, qualify the analysts, and carry out the tests, and document record keeping for all the test procedures that were carried out. Many companies complied, some more readily than others. But soon the malpractice of repeating a test ad nauseum till you got a pool of results that were favorable crept in. Manufacturers chose to collect enough favorable results and include them as part of their batch testing records, and either omitted to note down or just ignored without any investigation or justification the inconvenient results. In other words, what they were trying to do was test a batch into conformity. So the regulators, like most other people in other industries as well, recognized that quality cannot be inspected into a product or process. It must be designed, and it must be built into the product or process stage by stage. If you have multiple stages, then each stage shall have what is called acceptance criteria to take the process forward, and release criteria so that downstream the next unit operation is ready to receive good material, usable material. So this is how the concept of process validation was first mooted way back in 1987 by the US FDA in their compliance policy guide. The idea was to prove the sameness of the product and the process. Establish beyond all reasonable doubt its consistency, its homogeneity, its repeatability and reproducibility, batch after batch, making the same product regardless of whatever be the variables that may influence the process. The variables could come from the raw materials, different suppliers, or from the same supplier, batch to batch, lot to lot. The idea was to factor out all these disturbing influences and still produce a product that consistently meets its predetermined specifications. So this is how US FDA defined process validation. Establishing documented evidence. Now, if there are no documented evidence, then that process was not deemed to be validated at all. You need a documented evidence, which provides a high degree of assurance that a specific process, now if you have 100 processes, then each process shall be treated separately, validated separately. That a specific process will consistently produce a product meeting its predetermined specifications and quality attributes. Predetermined. Before you get into your validation exercise, you lay down what you would deem as acceptable product, acceptable quality. So it is not as if you take up the process validation and then depending on the results that you come, you then decide what are the acceptable attributes or specifications. The Europeans and the Pharmaceutical Inspectorate as well as WHO define validation as action of proving, in accordance with the principles of good manufacturing practice, that any procedure, process, equipment, material, activity or system actually leads to the expected results. So with the emergence of the pharmaceutical process validation concept, the following additional steps were added. Qualification of processing facility and its equipment. The equipment fit for use? Is the facility fit for use? Are the premises fit for use? Are the instruments fit for use? Qualification and validation of the manufacturing process through appropriate means. And finally, continual auditing, monitoring, sampling or challenging the key steps in the process for conformance to in-process and final product specifications. This is best exemplified by the validation stages flowchart that everybody recognizes on the cover page of Pharmaceutical Process Validation by Robert Nash. It starts with the process and the product design. Has that been completed? Once that is addressed, the equipment needed for processing. Is it designed properly? Is it installed properly? Is it operating properly? And then comes the element of PQ, the equipment used in processing. Is it functioning or performing as it is supposed to? And based on the data that comes out, you evaluate the data. If there's any inconsistency, you go back to fine-tune your process and equipment. And if there is consistency, the validation is deemed to be confirmed. Apart from the process validation, all support inputs had to be qualified. So you had the classical V model of qualification, which served as a basic framework for specification and qualification of premises, utilities, equipment, instruments, whatever. It all starts with the user defining his requirements in terms of user requirement specifications. It's led to the functional specifications and then to the design specifications and the design qualification. We went ahead then with system build, and at the IQ or installation qualification stage, you verified that the design specifications were being met. At the operational qualification stage, you not only verify the design specifications, you also verify the functional specifications. And finally, at the performance qualification level, you verify that the user requirement specifications are being met. So in 1987, the compliance policy guide insisted that no product, drug or device shall enter commercial distribution unless it has been approved by the regulators. And for regulatory approval, you needed to carry out what is called prospective or pre-market validation. The difference between the US and the Europeans had been that the US were willing to let you have one conformance batch, submit the data, their chemistry, manufacturing and controls division would review it and pass it on to the pharmaceutical inspectorate, and from there an inspector would come to visit your facility and check the data and the process and the facilities and the machinery and whatever else he wants to see. And once he's satisfied, he'd ask you to carry out 2 more batches, send the data across, it would be reviewed there, and an approval would follow. In the Europeans' case, they insisted that all 3 conformance batches had to be kept ready for inspection before they come. But these are matters of minor detail. 3 successful successive runs had to be completed before the product could come into the market. Now, after the approval and when the product has entered the market, if now you were to make any changes, either in the product or in the process or in the design or in the equipment train or any kind of change that could be impacting product quality or putting the patient at risk, then the inspector asked that the manufacturer should evaluate the changes, have an impact analysis carried out, a risk analysis carried out, and after all this was done, run the process all over again formally for revalidating that process. This is post-market. Revalidation is carried out after a product has entered commercial distribution. So along came a whole pile of pharmaceutical manufacturers, approached the regulators seeking clarification as to what do they do. They have been having a product for the past 2 or 3 or 4 decades, and there have been no safety, efficacy or quality issues. They are well-established products, proven in the market. What do we do in such cases where the product is already in the market? We are not talking about a new formulation. We are talking about an existing formulation. So the regulators reviewed the issue and came up with the suggestion that those products that are already well established, you should have a formal review of the batch records, that many successive batch records, and establish after statistical analysis that that process and product are in a high state of control. They called this retrospective validation, meant as a concession for those whose products were already there in the market before the compliance guide was issued in 1987. Then the regulators also wanted not just a kind of a process validation exercise where everything is kept as per normal conditions. They said no, if you have parametric windows or if you have physical properties of raw materials or in-process materials that has a window for each of its attributes or properties or characteristics, they would like boundary testing. Make sure that you have these 3 runs that you're having, each at an extremity in terms of its parametric or attribute levels. They called this the worst case. And they said, worst case is defined as a condition or set of conditions encompassing upper and lower processing limits and circumstances within standard operating procedures, which pose the greatest risk of product or process failure when compared to ideal conditions. Such conditions do not necessarily induce product or process failure. The idea was very simple. You may not have ideal conditions every day. There might be a migration here, there might be a drift there, and so is that process robust enough to be able to handle such variability that comes in inadvertently and still be able to produce reliably a good quality product. Now, nobody took all this too seriously. people were talking about process validation, and industry experts were also talking about process validation, but very few people really seriously took it on to themselves to actually establish their process as validated. Till they had the landmark Barr Laboratories case, where Justice Wallen came down hard on the practices in the industry, especially at Barr Laboratories. He was extremely critical about the practice at Barr Laboratories and the industry at large of testing ad nauseum till you get favorable results, testing a batch into conformance. He was very critical about this outlier that people use as an excuse for omitting inconvenient results. He taught them how to use statistics and how not to abuse statistics. He taught the industry about handling out of specification results. In fact, the word out of specification came into being from that judgment. And he talked about how a laboratory investigation should be carried out, and more importantly, how process validation should be carried out and why it is so important. By the evening, when the judgment was delivered, copies of that judgment were faxed to every district office by FDA. And from that day, on the strength of this one judgment, the FDA made significant headway in ensuring compliance in the industry. Now, when this happened, a whole pile of manufacturers came running to the regulators saying, hey, listen, we have a problem. You keep talking about 3 successive runs. Here we have a product. The batch size is so small. What will we do with 3 batches? The cost of the product batch is exceptionally high. We can't afford to make 3 batches. Here is a product which is rarely made. If we make it today, we probably don't have to make it for another 5 years. What will we do with 3 batches? So when such practical issues were brought to the fore and to the attention of the regulators, in 1993, they amended the guide and introduced a new concept called concurrent validation. In concurrent validation, you are still expected to collect data over 3 batches. But those 3 batches need not be made and kept for the inspector's approval and then released in the market. Each batch, as it is made, could be released into the market, but it could be done only with prior consent from the regulatory authorities. You give a proper justification, and if they accept that justification, then they permitted you, provided you did intensive, far more intensive than prospective validation, data collection, data evaluation, data review, and then once you're satisfied, you could release it in the market. This was a concession made in 1993. Things went along till 2004. By the time 2004 came up, the concept of validation had been in place for almost 17 years. So all those who had come to them saying that, hey, we already have a product in the market, etc., were given enough time to do retrospective validation and establish that their process was and had always been and continues to be in a state of control. So in 2004, the regulators felt that this retrospective validation as an approach to validation was no longer relevant, was no longer needed, and therefore withdrew it from that 2004 compliance policy guide. What else was new about that compliance policy guide? In 1987, process validation targeted formulators. But by 2000, ICH Q7 had come in, and API had been drawn into the fold of GMP compliance and regulations, and therefore The 2004 Compliance Policy Guide also referred to API manufacturers and asked them to go by ICH-Q7 guidelines. But there was a lot of things happening around them. The whole situation was in a state of flux because people recognized that quality was really not being designed or built into the product. So there was an expert working group working on QBD, that is ICH-Q8, and there was another expert working group on ICH-Q9, and there was another expert working group working on pharmaceutical quality systems, that is ICH-Q10. So there was a situation of flux at the time of the 2004 Compliance Policy Guide. But one significant thing it mentioned was it deleted the reference to 3 batches. It left it in the hands of the manufacturer and left it to him and his discretion to decide how many batches. They said that if the submission was robust enough, they would be willing to issue approval even prior to the performance or run of a conformance batch. So even before a conformance batch was actually taken up, they would be willing to give you the approval, provided your submissions established that you were operating from a platform of knowledge and process understanding.